In the first three modules of this unit, we focused on looking at elasticity of demand, elasticity of supply, and other different types of elasticities. Now we're also going to look at the benefit to the consumer and the producer of the equilibrium price that we established in Unit 2. And these are referred to as the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. So in this module, we're going to focus on that and learn a number of different things. The first thing I'll do is explain the meaning of consumer surplus and how it's related to the demand curve. After that, I'll explain the meaning of producer surplus and how it's related to the supply curve. Now, consumers, as you know, get all happy and giddy when prices fall. So how do we measure this additional happiness? What units would we use to tabulate it? Well, how about a unit of measurement that's easy to observe and compute and that's familiar to all of us? Money. Now, how much would you pay for some item? Let's say it's a bottle of water. How much would you pay for that? Or a diet soft drink or a turkey sandwich? Or maybe something more expensive like a ticket to a concert or a college basketball game or maybe a plane ticket to Mexico, something like that. Think about the highest amount of money, the most amount of money that you would pay for such an item. Not how much you think it would likely cost you to purchase it, not the actual price you would pay for it, but what is the most you would be willing to pay for it. This gets us to begin to think about what consumer surplus is actually all about. What is the most you would pay for a meal at Chick-fil-A? What is the most you would pay for a used car? This is what we call your willingness to pay. Now, after you know that amount, would you be happy to know that the actual price is only, let's say, $3.10 for a Chick-fil-A meal? Now, I know it costs more than that, but let's say that was the actual price. Would you be happy to find that out? And why would you be so happy? Well, the reason you'd be so happy is because you could purchase that item and then you'd have half of the amount of money that you were willing to pay to spend on other goods that make you happy. So anytime you or any other consumer pays less than his or her maximum willingness to pay, you and other consumers walk away with that extra money happy and a happy feeling that we call consumer surplus. Now, suppose several consumers are looking to buy a used textbook. You're in college, you go to the bookstore, and you're going to buy a used textbook. So here, we ask each student the maximum price he or she would pay for the textbook. And the answers are recorded in the table on this screen. Economists refer to this maximum price as the consumer's willingness to pay. So, how many textbooks will be purchased? Well, it depends on the price. Suppose the price is $15. Okay? Well, in that case, Alicia, Brad, Claudia, and Darren will buy the textbook, but Edwina will not. So, if the price of the textbook is $15, then 15 textbooks will be demanded. Now, suppose the price goes up to $30. Well, if the price goes up to $30, then Alicia, Brad, and Claudia will still buy the book, but now both Darren and Edwina will not. So the quantity demanded will fall to 3 textbooks. Basically, the willingness to pay can be used as a demand schedule, and it can be graphed here, like you see in this slide, like a stepwise demand curve. The height of each rectangle represents the maximum willingness of that consumer to pay for the book. Now, suppose that the price of the textbook is $15. We know that 4 textbooks will be sold, and those 4 students will benefit from the purchase. But how can we measure the benefit or the happiness they receive? Well, the first consumer, the first student, Alicia, was willing to pay $59. So she figures that she will receive $59 of enjoyment from the textbook. But she only had to pay $15 to purchase it. So the difference can be seen as a net gain in happiness for that consumer. Now in this screen, if we assume that the price of the book is $30 and Alicia was willing to pay $59, then she gets $29 as a net gain in happiness, and we measure that in dollars and we call it consumer surplus. So this slide shows us the consumer surplus that each student gets. Because Brad was only willing to pay a maximum of $45 for the textbook and he gets it for $30, he has $15 of surplus or happiness. Claudia, being willing to pay $35 and paying $30, gets $5 of consumer surplus or happiness. And of course, because the textbook was $30 and Darren and Edwina were only willing to pay $25 and $10 respectively, they don't get any surplus because they don't even get to buy and enjoy the book. So the consumer surplus can be seen in the graph as the area of the rectangles above the price, and here shaded in blue. So the area of Alicia's consumer surplus is $59 minus $30, or the $29 that she was getting multiplied by 1, the one book she would buy. Brad, it's $45, his maximum willingness to pay, minus $30, what he actually paid, $15 times 1. And for Claudia, it's $5 times 1. And so we take the area of each of those triangles and we sum them together, and that is the total consumer surplus that they would enjoy. 29 plus 15 plus 5. So that would be a total consumer surplus of $59. Now, if there were many buyers of textbooks, other than these 5, we could smooth out the demand curve to look like the many demand curves that have been drawn earlier in the course. And the total consumer surplus would then be seen as the area below the demand curve and above the price, the shaded blue triangle that you see here. And so with a linear demand curve, the total amount of consumer surplus is the area of this triangle, above the price and below the demand curve. Now, what if the price of the textbook changes? What if the price of anything changes? How does that affect consumer surplus? Well, a fall in the price of a good increases consumer surplus in 2 ways. Number 1, it's a gain to consumers who would have bought at the original price and now are buying at a lower price. And it's a gain to the consumers who didn't buy the good before, but who are now persuaded to buy at the lower price. That's if the price goes down. So, to see how consumer surplus is affected by a lower price, we can modify our curve. We can modify our curve to reflect a price of $20 instead of $30. Now, if it's $20, 4 textbooks will be sold instead of 3. And total consumer surplus now rises by the area of the dark blue triangle, which represents the increase in Alicia's consumer surplus, which is 10, the increase in Brad's consumer surplus, which is 10, and the increase in Claudia's consumer surplus, which is 10. So that's $30, but now we have $5 of Darren's surplus, and so that adds $35 to consumer surplus, to the $59 that we already enjoyed. So a lower price increases consumer surplus. As you might guess, a higher price will decrease consumer surplus in the same way. So we can see this in the graph as a smaller triangle, or a bigger triangle rather, of consumer surplus. The shaded area represents the increase in consumer surplus to the original buyers. Now, Likewise, as I said before, a higher price would decrease quantity demanded and decrease consumer surplus. The triangle below the demand curve and above the price would get smaller. Now, here's a practical real-world example of something that deals with consumer surplus. Every year, about 4,000 people in the United States die while waiting for a kidney transplant. The United Nations Service for this is devising a new set of guidelines where kidneys would be allocated not on the basis of who will receive the greatest net benefit, where net benefit is measured as the increase in lifespan from the transplant. This would increase the recipient's extra years by 11,000. The net benefit concept is kind of like consumer surplus, the individual consumer surplus generated from getting a new kidney. Now let's look at things from the producer or seller's standpoint. Sellers enjoy higher prices, and the benefit they receive is equal to the difference between the price received from the sale and the cost of producing each unit. In fact, this cost represents the minimum price the seller must receive to offer that unit to the market. As the price rises higher and higher above this cost, the seller earns more and more benefit, or what we call producer surplus. So suppose the price of textbooks, like most producers, experiences higher costs as the production of textbooks increases and as their cost increases. So let's assume that it costs $10 to produce the first textbook. So the seller must receive a minimum price of $10 before that unit will be offered for sale. The costs are given in this table that you see here. So we can see Andrew has a cost of $5 to produce the book. It costs Betty $15 to produce the book. It costs Carlos $25 to produce the book. Donna produces it for $35. And Amir, it costs him $45 to produce the book. So we can see that if the price of the textbook is $10, or, well, let's say it's $30. Here in this graph, we've made it $30. If the price is $30, then 3 textbooks will be supplied. This positive relationship between price and quantity supplied reflects the law of supply. And so these costs serve as a supply schedule, and a stepwise supply curve can be drawn. Now, suppose the price of the textbook is $30. We can adapt that table we saw on the previous screen to show how producer surplus is earned, and that 3 textbooks are supplied at this particular price. And we can calculate the area of each person's surplus. So for Andrew, who only has a cost of $5 to produce the book, his surplus is the price, $30, minus his cost, which is $5. So Andrew gets a surplus of $25. Betty gets a surplus of $15, and Carlos gets a surplus of $5. And so if we add all of those together, the 25 and the 15, which is 40, and the 5, you see a total producer surplus here of $45 if the price is $30. Now, just like we did with the demand curve, we can smooth out the supply curve to look like the many supply curves that have been drawn earlier in the course. The total producer surplus would then be seen as the area above the supply curve, which is the producer's cost, and below the price. With a linear supply curve, this area is a triangle, and the area of this triangle is the total amount of producer surplus. Now, just as changing prices could affect consumer surplus, changing prices can affect producer surplus. When the price of a good rises, producer surplus increases through 2 ways. 1, the gains of those who would have supplied the good even at the original lower price, and their surplus increases, and then the gains of those who weren't supplying the good before, who are now induced to supply the good by the higher price. So, to see how producer's surplus would be affected by a higher price, we can modify our table to reflect a price of $7. Now, at $7, that will increase the quantity sold. In this case, we're looking at quantity of wheat in millions of bushels. At a price of $5, 1 million bushels of wheat would be sold, and the area of producer surplus would be the area below the price of $5 down to the producer surplus line. But now we can see that there is a gain of producer surplus with a rise in the price to $7. And what's the area of gain? The dark red rectangle is the increase in producer surplus to original sellers, who now gain $2 in surplus for each unit sold. And then the area of the light pink shaded triangle, which is producer surplus gained by new sellers that were not selling wheat before. So the increase in producer surplus is the area of the rectangle added to the area of the triangle. And we can see this in the graph as a bigger total triangle than what we had before. Likewise, if we lowered the price, if there was a lower price, that would decrease the quantity supplied, and it would decrease producer surplus. The triangle below the price and above the supply curve would get smaller. So what have we learned in this module? Well, several things. Number one, we've learned that the willingness to pay of each individual consumer determines the demand curve. Secondly, we've learned that the difference between willingness to pay and price is the net gain to the consumer, which we call the individual consumer surplus. Total consumer surplus in a market, then, is the sum of all individual consumer surpluses in the market. We learned then that a rise in the price of a good reduces consumer surplus, and a fall in the price increases consumer surplus. Then we looked at the producer's angle of things. The cost of each potential producer is the lowest price at which he or she is willing to supply a unit of that good, and that determines the supply curve. If the price of a good is above a producer's cost, a sale generates a net gain to the producer, known as the individual producer surplus. Then total producer surplus in a market can be determined through the sum of the individual producer surpluses in a market, and that's equal to the area above the market supply curve but below the price. This concludes our look at Module 49, Consumer and Producer Surplus.